end of the spectrum.
No, because I mean it's such a broad field that I just trying to.
And because partly because we're interested in this idea that you might have a negative physiological response at the beginning, but somehow if your aesthetic understanding of the music is somehow positive, if you value that music, that in turn will somehow change your emotional response to it. So we want to investigate how that happens, and if there's a, you know, if one happens before the other, or if it can be both ways. So we want to kind of like, and also we're interested in the aesthetic categories that people use to, that common people use to talk about music and contemporary music in particular. So yeah, this is another kind of project that I'm doing.
May I ask, within this project, is there a way of calculating indifference as well?
Indifference, what do you mean by that?
Like no emotion either way, like no response.
Yeah. We can, but what we, you know, what is quite apparent in terms of the literature is that most people have some sort of emotional response, physiological, and you know, so even people that think that they're detached emotionally are still having some sort of response to the music. It's very rare that it's flat, the response. You know what I mean?
But it's always in response to the music. I guess could it be in response to something that's happening outside of the music in that moment, like not paying attention?
Yeah, of course, but that's why we have a large data set. So we have like 50 people in the audience, and then we can see, okay, there might be one that is, you know, is kind of thinking about something else, and then therefore, you know, sort of his signals might be a bit noisy and out of kind of like of the norm, let's say, in terms of the. But that's why what we're interested in as well. That for it to be statistically, let's say, relevant, it has to be, you know, a lot of people have to react that way. You know what I mean? Yeah.
But you find that this is a very low number of persons generally.
Yeah. Most people like have engaged with the music and have some sort of like emotional response to it.
And how many people at a time you generally?
50.
50. Okay.
Yeah. Cool. So again, this is just another project, but not what I'm talking about today. But if you are interested, I mean, we can talk about it. So this is, for example, this system that we use where we track facial kind of like responses through sensors, as well as you know, things like galvanic skin response and heartbeat and things like that. So and we also have this iPads as well for that.
What about biofeedback? Do you use also biofeedback systems?
No. It's
GSR, of course, it's like a galvanic skin response, but I mean just regular brainwave response.
No, we haven't gone into that because it's usually quite difficult and noisy in terms of like for statistical analysis and trying to figure out what people are feeling and thinking. It's still very early ages in terms of trying to make sense of that data. So yeah, this is usually how you know in music psychology, and especially in the emotion kind of in the subject of emotion, this is kind of the more standard way of measuring this. Okay, cool. So today though I'm going to talk about something.
There's the title of your lecture.
That's my title. Yeah, it's a bit long. So I mean, the title is just real-time composition and laptop improvisation, but yeah, the other stuff is not that important. Cool. So what I wanted to talk to you about today is what it's kind of a platform or environment that I've been developing for a while for laptop improvisation, and the type of considerations that I've been having in terms of developing that that environment. And yes, if anyone's interested also listening to some of my compositions or improvisations, there's my stuff. I'm also part of a composers collective called Squidbox, and we're also a net label, so we release a lot of stuff with them. Recently one with Paulina, which I might play a little bit later on. So historically, I don't want to go too back, because we could go back as as much as we want. So I'm just going to start in the 90s, and I mean this is a bit generic, so some of you might already know this. So I'm gonna try to skip through this part quickly so that we get into the system. But of course, one of the interesting things in the 90s is that you get not only portable computers but also processing speeds that are quite quick, so you can do basically a lot of the stuff that composers used to do by hand. All of those calculations can be done really quickly by a computer, and Robert Rowe, already in 2001 is talking about kind of like how real-time composition is a thing in terms of algorithmic composition, in terms of like all of those decisions that composers used to make before, right, can happen in real time, and therefore get back again into the performance, which is an interesting idea. So a lot of what I'm going to talk about is a little bit about some of these kind of real-time composition aspects, and also how that relates to improvisation as well, because in a way, once you start making real-time composition decisions in real time, you are also kind of improvising up to a certain point. But in terms of real-time composition, something that I just wanted to briefly talk about is live coding. So probably some of you are already familiar with live coding a little bit, but I'll go through it just very quickly. So live coding is a kind of practice that started in around the 2000s with the emergence of certain computer programs like Super Collider and Chuck, which are interpreted or on-the-fly programming. So what interpreted means is that usually with computer programs that are not interpreted, you have to write a long piece of code and then compile it, and then you get your program. With interpreted languages, you can, let's say, evaluate little bits of code that without having to write a long piece of code. So in a way, you can how to put it? So you can build your program gradually, right? And this for music is very good because you can, of course, test sounds very quickly, so hear them back very quickly, but you can also start almost performing in this way. So, for example, both Chuck and Super Collider are languages like that, where you can, start coding something and kind of like evaluating that code and getting some sort of sonic result, and then you can start modifying that sonic result, right? So with live coding, what you have is a kind of a new phenomenon where people are starting to code in live gigs, right? And this this started already quite early in the 2000s, but it's been growing exponentially, and now there's big kind of events where called algo raves, where where you have this kind of guys kind of typing code and making tracks on the spot, which is quite interesting. So let's see, there's a few interesting quotes about live coding. So some of the main people that started this movement are Alex McLean and Nick Collins, Julian Robber and Alex Ward, and this is I guess the first article, academic article that was published on the subject of live coding. But I think this is an interesting quote. Why not explore the interfacing of the language itself as a novel performance tool, in stark contrast to pretty but conventional user interfaces? We certainly contend that music making is more compelling with elements of risk and reference to the performance environment and to the human participant. And that the human participant is essential to social musical activities. Yet we do not wish to be restricted by existing instrumental practice, but to make a true computer music that exalts the position of the programming language, and that exalts in the act of programming and an expressive force of music closer to the potential of the machine. Live coding experiments with written communication and the programming mindset to find new musical transformation in a sweep of code. this is a very kind of like manifesto like kind of text, which is kind of fun. This is kind of a more kind of description of what live coding really is. Which some people call on-the-fly programming as well. So on-the-fly programmable system provides the ability to write, modify, compile, execute new existing codes, and then integrate it into a program while it's running with precise timing and synchronization. The goal of on-the-fly programming is to enable programmers, performers, composers to actively modify their programs online without having to stop code and restart. For example, performers could add, change modules in their synthesis or composition programs or modify mappings to their controllers during a live performance. Similarly, composers can experiment with their programs online, modifying synthesis components, shaping and perfecting a sound, or changing compositional elements without having to restart. So, I mean, one of the interesting things about live coding, I think, is that if you think about it, coding, computer coding can go from very low level to very high level. So in a way, live coding has to happen somewhere, right? And usually it happens in the higher level of the programming. So no one's going to go and write, let's say, a unit generator that produces a sine oscillator or something like that during a live gig, right? That's kind of like ludicrous. So usually live coding has a more sort of musical element, and it has to do more with kind of like making some sort of musical decisions, which are in a way kind of a way of real-time composition, right? Cool. So one of the things that is also interesting about live coding is that in live coding events, what you get is this kind of guys also projecting the code during the gigs, right? So that's part of the aesthetics. Is to actually project what you're kind of typing or writing, and as a way of engaging with the audience. But of course, not everyone knows how to code, so that excludes a lot of people. But still, it might look nice and
cool.
It might look cool. Yeah. So a lot of people kind of like that kind of element, even though they might not understand. But also they might, even if they don't program, try to kind of like
you see someone typing a command, you're like, he's gonna type it, he's gonna do it. Yeah, he did it.
yeah, exactly.
Like he's gonna use that function.
Yeah, exactly. So it's a bit nerdy, but it's happening, and people.
And is it actually exciting for audience?
Well, it depends. For some people, yes. I mean, some people really really enjoy it.
Yes.
I think personally, I think it depends. Like sometimes I've seen some very lame examples.
It's probably as exciting as a modular concert. Like people that are into modular think it's so interesting to watch all this patching, but it's really not. It's just moving wires around.
Yeah, exactly.
And I guess it
It's pretty
depends
much the same thing, really.
Yeah, exactly.
It's very similar, to be honest. Yeah. Cool. So, I was going to. I'll play you an example of live coding in a second. And I guess the also something that is kind of a bit more recent is that there's this new kind of environments that people are using, like Tidal and Sonic Pi. So people are not using, let's say, Super Collider or Chuck, which are in a way more low level. They're kind of already doing environments that are specific to live coding, and that have certain things built in, so that kind of that is not as raw, say, because when you do it in something like Super Collider, it's a bit raw in the sense that, well, for example, you might not have a mastering kind of like bus with a with a limiter on it or stuff like that, so you would have to code that in as you live code. So these environments already have some inbuilt kind of things that that allow you to to play in a more relaxed way and yeah.
Do people usually start with like a blank screen, or do they load up like already sections of code and then kind of modify them?
I think there's both approaches are quite common. So some people always start from scratch, and that's kind of like their philosophy, that they always start from scratch.
But it's not really blank anyway, because if you don't have a foundation to make sound, there's nothing. So it's all just degrees of somewhere between pushing a button on a Casio and writing a few lines of code.
Yeah. No, I agree. and there's some dogmatic aspects about it as well. Which so a lot of people do it also to show off their programming skills, right? Not necessarily for the musical kind of like aspect. But I guess, you know, some people almost say that that's kind of also part of it, that, you know, that live coding is something that is not only about the music, but it's also about kind of the
coding itself.
The coding itself, exactly. So yeah. But we'll talk about the criticisms of live coding in a bit, because what I do in a way is kind of a response to some of the live coding kind of stuff and situation. Well, another kind of thing that I just wanted to talk about, which, I mean, I can skip this a little bit, is, you know, it's this idea that when you have kind of algorithmic tools, but also sort of synthesis tools that are happening on the fly, that these tools, you know, somehow both composers that are into real-time composition have become interested in improvisation, as well as the opposite. So a lot of kind of improvisers have become interested in kind of like these generative and algorithmic systems that allow for some, you know, for this kind of performance. So there is an interesting sort of merge almost in between the two practices that I think that has been happening, and I think that's an interesting situation. My approach, I'm a composer, so, you know, my way into it was, you know, I was a composer. I wrote for ensembles, and then went into more conventional electronic music and so forth. And then, you know, once I started to realize these kind of real-time possibilities of algorithmic composition and stuff like that, I started to use, you know, to put them in practice in improvisation as well, because I found out that I could make a lot of these decisions that, you know, someone like Xenakis, for example, would, you know, do, you know, before. I could do that just in real time, so I could take, you know, these kind of decisions as, you know, as the gig was happening, which I find quite interesting. So so now let's talk about some of the limitations of live coding, because I think, you know, as I said before, one of the issues about live coding is that it's mostly, the movement is mostly started by, you know, people that are into computers and so forth, and also a lot of this kind of algorithms, for example, are very specific to particular types of music, you know, so particularly electronic dance music. So very rarely you see a live coder with a musician, for example, with a live musician playing along, or trying to interact with another musicians. But you sometimes get these, you know, people kind of getting into each other's codes through networks and stuff like that. But it's still very much kind of like, I feel that it's led by, you know, by coding rather than music making sometimes. And one of the real issues that I find about this, in terms of thinking about musically how to interact with instruments, is that obviously when you're writing codes, you're writing code for a little bit, right, before you actually execute it and you hear something. So there is this kind of like time kind of built in there in the musical structure almost, that you have to, you know, have while you're typing the code, right? So I think that that's a limitation in terms of being able to have, you know, this kind of musical ideas that happen a lot in improvisation, in terms of exchange, for example, and immediacy, you know, of trying to kind of like very quickly respond to someone, trying to make some sort of kind of, you know, connection with other players. So let me play you.
Too loud, just let me know. We have the air condition, so I bet that perhaps we can put it a little bit.
Yeah,
a chance.
Fine.
Okay,
that's fine. So I'm gonna play you a little set by Andrew Sorensen, who's a quite famous live coder from not so long ago, and just to make the point that, you know, it takes a little bit of time to build these musical structures. So.
And what language is this?
I think this is some sort of Python.
We only work in assembly.
Well, I mean, this guy is really low level. Like he doesn't use Super Glider or Chuck even. He uses I think it's yeah. Lisp, sorry.
Oh, Lisp.
Yeah.
But wait, he's cheating. But he's already got something going.
Yeah, no, but this is not the beginning.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, sorry. Okay, so while it's kind of nice music, I guess it's it takes a long time.
Live sampling of live coding.
Live sampling. It takes a long time to get anything going, right? And I think this is somehow a real limitation, especially if you want to interact with live musicians. So the project that I've been kind of like working on for a few years now, it's called Modularity, Immediacy, and Exchange in Laptop Improvisation, because I think that in a way those are some of my concerns, and I think that they're really important to the core of what improvising is. And in a way, it is a difficult problem that a lot of people that play their laptop or electronics in general have, right? So how to, make something when you have like a really experienced, let's say, acoustic improviser, how to kind of be able to respond to that person as quickly as they respond to other people or to yourself, right? So it is a difficult problem in terms of solving that, and I've been kind of like thinking about how to deal with this problem, but at the same time without having limitations in terms of the improvisation, because one of the when you have, for example, like an Ableton kind of project, for example, you set up your stuff there, and and you have like a vocabulary of things that you can use within that project, but but after a while your project becomes a bit limited, and then either you open another project, or it's very hard to start modifying it as you play. In terms of getting new modules in, and it's something that that is kind of challenging. So what I'm interested is in kind of this idea of using live coding in a way to bring that modularity and quick response that you can get in terms of like getting different modules in and things like that, for example. And then, but at the same time, trying to deal with this problem of like not having to type like for a minute before you get like any kind of results, right? Because you want to establish kind of really quick relationships. So
the question why is answered. I mean, because the obvious question. I speak as a guy who's written a fair amount of code. Yeah. And I can't imagine anything more contrary to improvisation and spontaneity and musicality than writing code. I mean, it's a very interesting process. Yeah. And it's very musical in very similar composition. Yeah. But it's like you can't compose much on the fly in C++. Yeah. So my question is, why? If you have so many other tools, why this particular idea? Okay. And you hinted at it because you said that, well, you have Ableton, you can set it up and so on, but you can't get out of it. Yeah. And so you're suggesting that maybe live coding techniques would allow you to bypass some of the walls of a system like Ableton Live?
Exactly. That's right. So that's
any other ideas that would why?
yeah. That's
not how.
That's basically the reason that I want to have an unlimited amount of possibilities. Let's say, well, they're obviously always limited, but
but you mean within the like a dialogue of improvisation with another musician?
Yeah. yeah. Well, I mean, you can also use this technique in, you know, for any kind of performance. I guess it's not necessarily with, you know, with another. You know, you can do solo stuff as well.
Yeah, but I guess I'm curious about this dialogue, because if you're dealing with somebody, say, with an acoustic instrument that has its range, it doesn't have an unlimited possibility.
Yeah, no, that's true.
So what does it need to have the unlimited possibility compared to, like, to have an even dialogue?
Yeah, well, because I somehow feel that with electronics and laptop-based kind of performances, you're even more constrained in a way than you know, in a way in terms of than the live player in a way. So I guess it's partly because of that, and maybe it's just a desire to be excessive as well. I don't know.
No, I just think it's interesting because this topic has been addressed very much through interfacing, of course, like through Steinman.
Yeah.
Like, you know, like DJ Sniff.
Yeah.
His,
I know.
His method of dealing with his.
No, I don't criticize that at all. I'm absolutely fine with that approach. I just find that my own approach is more compositional. So, you know, because I see myself more as a composer. I feel that when I'm doing very physical things, I get distracted by the physicality of playing an instrument almost. So what I'm interested in, why I call it real-time composition as well, is because I'm not particularly interested in me myself doing that kind of physical thing, because I'm more concerned with kind of structural, timbral, kind of other kind of sort of things. You know what I mean?
Yeah, but I think this is the almost rhetoric question, because when we are checking this on the history, then there was a strict division between non-real time and real time. So certain things were non-real because they need time for calculation, you know.
Yeah.
And then while we speed up the system, we've got this point when we can really calculate and arrange things online.
Yeah.
Online, which was your introduction, but also really live.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think there's a matter of the accessibility of your access to the really bottom of the system. That's more like this, that you don't need to use any ready-made, prepared in advance things, but you are really able to control on different levels, starting from the particular and small patches of your system to the global.
And there's something nice with what you were saying about Xenakis in the beginning, because, for example, to answering your question why, is one of the reasons might be that if I code playing with a live instrument, for example, the live instrument is very quick translation of imagination to the sounds of that limited, in a way, instrument. But as a coder, if the language is developed enough, I can imagine, for example, in this progression that the acoustic instrument is playing, maybe a set of very complex clusters would fit.
But the question would be what we are talking about. Are we talking about stochastic programs where he composed scores for instruments using special coding techniques, or we are talking about UPIC system, which is rather the graphic interface to produce the acoustic form of the piece, without instruments? I think that those are the really different. So I don't know what we are talking about. Are we talking about this?
I mean,
I'm mostly talking about the stochastic stuff and the generative kind of processes and stuff.
Because there are different parts of the system.
I mean, like,
and
it's
well,
a very attractive
I guess
idea.
another reason why I don't use Ableton or stuff like that is that then I can also make my own tools that do some things that Ableton doesn't do. I mean, so that's one of the main priorities of coding, is also just to make your own tools, right? And having the ability of kind of like of doing what you want to do.
So I think there will be one there will be one interesting point to compare kind of pure data max environment, which is like an object-oriented environment, with a coded environment. So I think those are the difference, in fact, because even with max power, which we know, in this discussion, in this discourse, it's like a ready-made object based on objects which are ready, so they have to be designed earlier, and then they can be manipulated. Yeah. Of course, we know that the C sound is also part of the Mac, so that's another story.
Yeah.
We know those hybrid systems where we can really go to the spectrum of sounds live as well. But I'm talking about the general idea that.
But I mean, we'd have to
we
step
have
back, I think
we have a list of codes
yeah.
run live and controlling loops and then manipulating this structure, or we have something which is an instrument designed and we are manipulating over the modules which are already ready.
Yeah.
I think this is the
and I mean,
but the computer itself we have to think about. I mean, if you really want to discuss this, we have to step back further.
Sorry, you got to build your own.
Sorry?
Sorry, you have to build your own.
Well, no, I mean,
Computer,
of course, this is ludicrous, but the idea, like, so it isn't, you know, there is always, like, there is a bit of a step forward from what we're thinking, and we're trying to get to the clean slate thing. This is just really not possible.
Yeah, and
So
it's not the purpose of, I mean, live coders are not interested in that either.
Yeah.
So what they're interested is going somewhere there, in between the, let's say, the compiler codes and the very high kind of like coding, maybe without going into the graphical interface domain. But it's just like still, you know, they're not gonna start and writing and compiling, you know, like code. It doesn't make sense. It's not. So that's not the purpose. So the idea is that coding can be expressive and that you can create certain structures in a live kind of situation that, you know, that might be interesting, novel. Let me just continue a little bit because I think my approach is quite different from the traditional live coding one. So because I think that when you're dealing with laptop-based improvisation, what you have to think about is almost, let's say, what you leave to how to put it, like there's always some preparation that goes in, right? So you cannot always start from scratch.
I think there's a different noise coming from the keyboard than this one.
But I
Using the microphone,
can I ask you to just clarify one thing? There's a bit of a discursive question. The real-time composition and improvisation, and then real-time computation. I just want to find out what you mean by real-time composition compared to improvisation or real-time computation.
Well, I mean, like for me, they're, you know, by now they're really kind of mixed. So, you know, I think what I do, I call it improv, but in a way, you know, my approach to improv is kind of looking at it from an almost real-time compositional way. So that's why I'm kind of talking about the two, because there's many other approaches as well, right? Like that you could do laptop improvisation with, you know, with sensors and with kind of different interfaces and all sorts of things. But I think the reason that I'm talking about this is because that's kind of like what I find myself doing is at the moment is, you know, I call it improvisation, but at the same time when I tell people this is improvisation and I show them my system, then people say like, that's not improvisation, that's, you know, that's composition or something like that. So I you know, I've had some interesting discussions about this with, you know, colleagues in different.
All right, so do it.
Okay. Okay, cool. Well, we talked about this. So let me talk a little bit about my approach. So what I do is a bit different in that I'm not interested in writing long bits of, you know, bits of code because I think they take too long. So what I do in a way is cheat a little bit. So what I do is is closer to command line programming. So I mean, are you guys familiar with command line kind of style programming? You know, like if you, okay, yeah. So for example, before we had operating systems, you might remember this, Paulina. But you know, you remember DOS, right? So everyone remembers DOS. So the way that you would
I have never used DOS. I'm too young.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh wow. Okay.
We remember you.
All right. Well.
But it doesn't matter.
The new generation. Well, you still can use.
I think in certain moment it will be good when because perhaps you know each other, but there are some members like Tony Miłosz from Oakland. We don't know personally, but you find out that he is involved in the in the discussion very much,
I can explain
which is very quite interesting.
So before I play you
nice that you came today.
So command line programming, basically, it's a way of accessing, for example, your operating system through short commands that you type in a computer terminal. So, for example, in DOS, you know, if you wanted to go to a different folder, you had to do, you know, press a few commands, and then you would go to that folder. If you wanted to have a new file, right, you would do that. If you wanted to open an application, you had to do, like, you know, little command to open the application, and so forth. I mean, this came to me when I have a really good friend who's you know, who's an incredible programming geek, and he doesn't use his operating system because he thinks it's too slow. So he actually has, you know, the kind of hacker type kind of standard setup with kind of lots of monitors, as you would see in television, you know, like the typical hacker, and he runs everything from terminal, right? And I was just looking at him, and he's like so fucking fast. Excuse my language, Paulina. But he's, you know, he just like opens applications, closes them. You know, he's like doing all of this stuff super fast just within the terminal. And I thought to myself, well, you know, that's probably a really good approach to live coding, right? So rather than having, let's say, you know, sort of long bits of codes, what you can do is to have really short commands that you type as quickly as possible, and then try to access all of these different modules and stuff like that. So, so that got me thinking, and then that's kind of the approach I've taken. That it's, you know, I've come up with a kind of a command style kind of environment where I type things, and my particular interest is typing quick and getting quick responses, right? So that I don't have to type so much, and then very quickly I get some sort of meaningful result, right? And what it is in reality is these commands, what they do is that they get a little bigger piece of code, and then evaluates that. So in a way, it's like live coding, but instead of like writing like all of those little bits, you just write a little command that calls in that code, right? So that's kind of like my approach. So rather than trying to, you know, do everything from scratch, even though you could in my system as well, I find it that, you know, to have a more musical and immediate kind of response, like that this approach kind of,
it's like sub-patching in pure data, kind
of. A little bit, yeah. It's like calling sub-patches, you know, but without having the constraint that a sub-patch is still within the environment. So it would be like, let's say if that was the case, it would be like that I type something and then there's a sub-patch, and then I type something and there's another sub-patch that's running, and then I get rid of that one and bring another one. So it's kind of like, it would be like a live, live patching in a way, but a very quick one that would just kind of bring things in and out. So that's kind of the equivalent.
And would like cutting and pasting be completely out of the question? Like having preset code, I mean, this is a bit naive, I guess, but I don't work with coding. Like to have it already a series of code that you can cut and paste and drop. So you're not writing it, you're pasting.
Well, what I do is that I assign certain commands to certain bits of code, precisely. So you know, it's not necessary to cut and paste because I just type a little command and then that.
Okay.
Yeah, and then if I want to get rid of it, that also.
So you're expediting the code a bit.
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, and so these are, for example, some of the kind of commands that I use, which are, as you can see, quite short, right? So, you know, like there's all sorts of stuff there that I can, you know, kind of change very quickly on the fly. And what I realize is that I forget sometimes some of them. And then during a gig I'm like, oh, I remember that one. And then I use it. But also you can, you know, like obviously if you forget them, you can always call them and then you can see them, you know, so you know, you can get a list of them as well in the system. So I find that this kind of approach where I type a few, like a short command and then a few numbers and then bang, is quite effective. So another limitation of coding live is, for example, things like buffer allocation, which you know, everyone who has code